Finding God in Those Mundane Moments. This is episode 78 of En Route. Hello and welcome to En Route, the podcast at the intersection of church and Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Well, I think it's good to take a break from all of the talk about war and lately fear of nuclear war to hear a conversation with Corey Nathan. This was recorded about a week and a half ago. And we had a wide-ranging conversation on theology and culture and life in general. It's a little bit different than recent interviews. Most of those have always had a specific focus on an issue. Instead, this is much more of a free-flowing conversation about faith, civility, respect, and gratitude. Corey hails originally from New Jersey, where he grew up an observant Jew. In his mid-20s, he became a Christian, much to the chagrin of his family. He basically became part of American evangelicalism, and it was while he was in that milieu that he really understood the shortcomings of evangelicalism and how sometimes Scripture conflicted with some of its cultural positions. He has a diverse background, probably one that I've never seen before, from being a stockbroker to a headhunter to the head of a theater and film ministry and so much more. One of the things that he does these days is that he is the co-host of a popular podcast, How to Talk About Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, which in this day and age, I seem to be a very apt topic or to be chatting about. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife Lisa and 3 children. So let's listen to this conversation with Corey Nathan. Well, it is good to talk to you, Corey. I've heard a lot about you. I've heard the podcast, and so I'm great to be able to talk with you for an hour about life and politics and all of this stuff. So,
yeah, no, I've been listening to your podcast, and I really appreciate some of the conversations you have. I'm always enlightened. You know, I also appreciate how you bring in folks with different points of view. And oftentimes we think there's only 2 points of view. So even within certain subjects, it's good to understand, nuance within those subjects. I really appreciate how you bring on a nice array of guests. So that's it's been helpful for me.
Yeah, and I think for me, the cool thing is, you brought up nuance, and you talk about that on your podcast, and that is something I think that is missing in our culture more and more. We don't have nuance. Everything is very much black or white, very simple. And life is not that way. I mean, it's never been that way. And nuance makes it a hell of a lot more interesting.
It sure does. It sure does. Yeah, I was talking with a fella just about any given issue. We could just say, I'm pro-gun, I'm anti-gun, I'm, pro-abortion, I'm anti, but it just doesn't work that way. Even friends of mine or family members of mine who take abortion, for example, they would consider themselves pro-choice, but within pro-choice, there are folks who think, wow, I really think that we can make a really strong case that life starts at however many weeks. My brother defined it as when there's a heartbeat and brain activity, which is really early on, and he still considers himself pro-choice. So to label someone with just categorically this way or that way, I think in any given issue, even the most contentious ones, is a mistake, and we're missing out on a whole rainbow of possibilities.
I think so. I think the question I always have is, why do we do that? That I think that seems to be a temptation now more than ever. We want to paint people into corners. So this person is this way, this person is that way. And we don't really want to ask those questions or to find out more about them. I don't know if that's something that you have noticed so much, and if you have any kind of observations of why that is.
Yeah, I think about it all the time. And I think there are a lot of proclivities we each can give into. One of those proclivities, frankly, is just intellectual laziness.
Mm-hmm.
If we no longer have to think deeply about important issues, it's less strenuous for us. It's easier, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, to make it easier on ourselves, sometimes we outsource our thinking. Well, our pastor said X, Y, or Z. Okay, got it. Now we don't have to think about it anymore. I just read something about John MacArthur is a very prominent pastor in the valley where I live, and he's a prominent pastor around the country. And in the summer of 2020, he said, well, something along the lines of, well, folks who aren't voting for Trump probably aren't Christians. A very, very loose quote. I forget exactly how he said it, but the implication was very clear that you couldn't possibly vote for Biden and be a Christian. So I think a lot of folks, I'm friends with a lot of folks who go to GraceCom, and sometimes the tendency is, he said it, we believe it, let's move on. I just don't think that's a healthy way to go about theology, let alone relating to our neighbors. So I don't know why it is, but I do think that we have to resist that temptation or that proclivity to be intellectually, spiritually, mentally lazy. I think it's a better way to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength if we really continue to think through these issues. Even when Scripture seems to speak very clearly on certain things. I'll give you an example. About 15 years ago or so, there was the issue of, and this is a confession of sorts, the issue of Prop 8 was big in California. I think it must have been 2004, because it was one of the props that Karl Rove put on the ballots in individual states to engender a sense of energy among a certain part of the population. And it was about gay marriage. And at the time, the best I could do was come to a sort of libertarian stance on that. So I ended up voted against Prop 8 because I thought, listen, I don't happen to be gay, but I have neighbors and friends and family members who are. And I believe certain things because I think I'm deriving those things from Scripture, but my neighbor doesn't, my friend doesn't. So it's not my place to impose particular beliefs on those people. But I think that my theological thinking was off base. I think that, over time, I read certain translations of the Bible, and I, gleaned certain things where there was from the Hebrew Bible or certain letters from the New Testament, and we all know what they are. But I really didn't. I think even though I was reading certain translations, I think it's still incumbent upon us to continue to dive deeper. Well, is the best translation of that word really homosexuality or homosexuals or homosexual acts, or is the ancient Hebrew or the Aramaic or the Greek, is a better translation something else? I've come to the understanding that it's saying something else. But just sharing that evolution in thinking and understanding, I think it's important for us to do that important work and to keep an open heart and open mind about the possibility that whatever conclusion we arrived at 15 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, or however long it was, yesterday, we could be wrong. I'm a Christian, but I am not Christ. I love Jesus, but I ain't him. So that means I could be wrong, so.
Yeah, I've shared this story, and I think it's actually even a podcast episode. This was back in the early '90s at a church in DC, and they were going to have a new pastor come on, and this was a Baptist congregation. And the person that they were hiring was very much open and affirming when it came towards gay people. The congregation was kind of part progressive, but part evangelical. And so there was always going to be kind of some friction. And this pastor had a friend who was an evangelical woman. And that woman got up and spoke, and they said, we don't agree, and we don't agree on this issue, but we're friends. And I think that she would make a good pastor. And I always share that story because it's so amazing that she was willing to reach across, because she saw this woman, the pastor, as a friend and someone that had good skills, even if they disagreed on this issue. But there was kind of a willingness to understand the complexity that was there that I don't think we could do today. I don't see that could happen today at all, because we have kind of, as you said, become intellectually lazy and tribal. And so we don't really want to cross those barriers, even for the sake of friendship, because we want to have loyalty to a certain tribe. And I think that that's kind of sad.
Yeah, I was curious about that as well. Let me just answer that more directly by saying, I want to hold out hope. Mm-hmm. I want to hold out hope that we know how to do this. What the illustration that you just shared, we know how to do this. We remember how to do this. We can do this. And it's not to say that there aren't any issues, there aren't any hills worth dying on. There may be, or lines in the sand. There's no lines in the sand that you can cross. I just think that a lot of folks, there are too many lines in the sand. What hill are you ready to die on? What hill are you ready to fight for? I think there are too many of them, you know? And if we're a silly example, so I'm an Auburn fan, War Damn Eagle, and because my wife's from Alabama, and some of her neighbors are Alabama fans. And the way I was introduced into the Iron Bowl, into that rivalry, was we're friends every day of the year, but the Saturday after Thanksgiving, But then this incident happened where a dude was listening to the radio and he said, I'm going to show those Auburn. It was one of the years that Auburn won. I'm going to show them. I'm going to kill all them. There are these trees that a bunch of Auburn fans and students celebrate around, and I'm going to kill them. And he poisoned the dirt around the trees as his way of protesting and showing those damn Auburn fans, And
Goodness.
I just thought, man, that's one of those hills that you're dying on or killing trees on, literally. I think we've gone too far here, but I just want to hold out hope that we know how to do this, that we can redefine what is worth fighting for. I just think it's a smaller set of issues that we really got to get heated, and I defer to, whenever possible, nonviolent resistance, communication, stay at the table, stay in the relationship, stay in the conversation. So I try to do that, but listen, to be totally candid, there are some times when it's just too much. I got to back away. Mm-hmm. There's some issues where I can't even, I don't want to start throwing rocks. I want to hold out hope. But it's hard for me to be in that conversation. Folks who are still kind of, to give you an example, folks who are sort of explaining away January 6th, or saying it was really Black Lives Matter, or saying it was really Antifa, or saying something along the lines of, look what you made us do. It's like justifying violence and trying to overturn democracy. I can't necessarily be in that conversation. I'm not going to start throwing rocks at them. I'm not going to engage in the violence, but I can't necessarily. So I do have limitations too, if I'm being totally totally candid about it.
So one of the interesting things about you is that you kind of come from an evangelical background, but even before that, you grew up an Orthodox Jew. So I'm just kind of curious the road of how that conversion happened, and then how did those two traditions inform who you are now, especially in this political religious context that we are living in.
Yeah, that's a big question. I do want to clarify, though. I would describe myself as an observant Jew who was part of an Orthodox synagogue. So I don't want to be misleading in that I wasn't a chassid. But we did keep kosher and keep Shabbos and all the holidays, not just Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But but you ask a big question. How does that? What was the last part of your question again? How does that all come together or inform?
How does it all come together, and how is it how does that guide you in this current religious and political context?
Yeah. Well, the way that I became a Christian is kind of a long story, but I will say that there was a series of doors that I heard the knocking, and I started to open them up one at a time. And I had certain questions that had been percolating for years, and through a pretty intense process. It was when I was 29 years old. There was a period of about 6 or 8 months where I was just reading voraciously. I mean, literally is at least a 6 or 8 or sometimes 10-hour a day reading habit, because I just wanted to explore these questions. The door had opened up for the empirical case of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and nobody had ever even presented that, even bad arguments about that possibility. So I just started exploring it, and it wasn't just looking for evidence like the Josh McDowell and Lee Strobel stuff. It was looking for a set of theological and philosophical answers, while at the same time comparing what other philosophies that I'd studied previously. And really long story short, I had finally come to the conclusion that the uniquely Christian set of answers to how did this all come about? What is wrong in this creation? Who we are as a people, or me as a person within a people? Where is this all going? And the uniquely Christian set of answers made more sense to me, intellectually, spiritually. So some of those questions had a spiritual element, of course. I could feel it. Again, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I could feel it palpably. So finally, I read the New Testament. That whole time I hadn't read the New Testament, but the New Testament to me read like a uniquely Jewish set of documents. And it really spoke to me. Jesus spoke to me as a rabbi and a prophet. And I came to the conclusion that Jesus was Messiah, that Jesus was is risen. And, I had to learn a whole bunch of new stuff, like how to talk to God without an organized prayer, and then I had to learn a whole bunch of new stuff after I started talking to God as a believer in Jesus as Messiah, such as how to tell my Jewish parents that I'm a Christian now, So that's also, by the way, a huge part of what a lot of my focus is now, in that I have to learn how to speak with people across differences, some differences which are very heated. There's great chasms between some of these differences that we're talking about. So I have to be earnest about that and understand what sinews hold us together, as well as to really name those differences so we can understand them better and drive down better. And how that all comes together now is sort of what I said before, in that a lot of what I believe as a Christian is informed by who I am as a Jew, Like sometimes it's said that I left my faith, I left my religion. I didn't really leave my religion, nor did my religion leave me.
Mm-hmm.
I've evolved some things that I've thought. Obviously, a lot of non-Christian Jews don't think Jesus is a Messiah. Even casual, like once a year Jews, people who are only Jews because of their family, their heritage, they know, hey, you got that Jesus thing, you're not a Jew anymore. Like, so there's that. But I believe that these conversations have been going on for 2,000 years. I imagine, I read scholars like not Josh McDowell, N.T. Wright,
Mm-hmm.
great historian,
yes,
great theologian, I think. And his work helps me to reimagine first century Israel, first century Palestine, and reimagine someone like Peter going home to his family and saying, I've been listening to this man, Jesus, and I think he's it. I think he's the Messiah, or the next generation of believers having that same conversation. And talk about a heated moment in history. The temple is literally burning. The center of their religion and their education and their politics and their economy was literally burning, about a generation after Jesus. And that's the time that certain people were going home to their families and saying, I believe Jesus is the risen Lord. I believe Jesus is the risen Messiah. I believe he's it. So fast forward 2,000 years, and you got one Jew from Jersey who has to go home and have the same conversation. I don't think I was facing quite a bit of scrutiny, especially from certain family members, but not quite that much scrutiny. So got to keep it in perspective,
How do you think your faith has been, I think, strengthened because of your Jewish background? Because I think one of the things that I think a lot of us forget, of course, is that Christianity sprang from Judaism, and that for the first few decades, most of the early church were Christians who were originally Jews. And so that has been something I think, sometimes forget. And how has that helped you as a person of faith, kind of to see things? How has it helped to strengthen your faith to see that connection?
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought of it exactly the way that you asked it, but what comes to mind is there are perhaps deeper roots that not just a person who is born into a Jewish family can tap into, but anyone who's part of the people of God can tap into. Because the other thing is we can place ourselves within the larger story that way, that we can, if we believe this thing, whether you're young earth creationist, old earth creationist, or something other than that, then you can buy into this narrative of a creator God who we're living within his creation or her creation. I had an interesting conversation with a theologian about removing that male identifier from God because he's more transcendent than that. But that's another conversation. But the creator God, he created this creation, and then he created us as creatures, human beings as creatures, with the opportunity to commune with him, to be in communion with him, but also to elevate the value of that loving communion by giving us the opportunity to freely choose that relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
But giving us the freedom to choose that relationship inevitably means, if we are not God, which the two most strongest convictions that I have is there is a God and I ain't him, right? But being not God, being not a perfect creature, I'm inevitably going to choose something other than, a perfect communion, perfect relationship with God. So that's Genesis 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the fall.
Yep.
Now the rest of the story going forward until Revelation 22. And in a way, the story of God's story is still being written, and we're in it. So where are we? We're participating in God's redemption plan. Once the fall happened, once freely choosing something other than God's ideal, the rest of the story is God knew that in advance. And he said, okay, so we're going to create this whole redemption thing. And it's through the people of Israel, people descended from Abraham at first, and then he redefined it or spread it out, or I don't know the right word for it, but around the person of Jesus. So yeah, it's still the people of Israel, the people descended from Abraham, but also the God, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God among us, right? And then God redefined who the people of God were to allow those all nations around the person of Jesus. I don't know if I'm making any sense right now.
Yes, you are making some sense.
But to me, that makes sense. To sum it up, there's another theologian that I really appreciated, Kevin Van Hooser. He wrote, I met him one time when he was working on the drama. I think it was called The Drama of Doctrine. Mm-hmm. I might have the title wrong, but he summarized what he was working on by saying the Bible, in a way, is a story that's still being written, and we're in it. So we get to participate in what God is doing in his creation. I believe in an open universe. I believe in a creator God. I believe that God can act within his creation. And I believe that he's giving individuals an opportunity to participate in that as a part of the bigger redemption project. So I'm participating with you just in this conversation. Mm-hmm. Tikkun Olam, make the world a better place. We all get to participate in that. Now, Christians would obviously say, no one comes to the Father but through me, as it says in Scripture. But we can. That's where we go to seminary and talk about that and throw different ideas around and kind of start to form what our actual beliefs are. But that's it, man. I don't know. That was a long way around the barn, but hopefully I answered your question.
So where do you think you see in this time period? And I think as a period that we are so divided, and especially, in the aftermath of January 6th, where do you see God's redemptive work happening?
I see it happening in conversations just like this.
Okay.
I see it happening in folks. I think that if we're looking for an earth-shattering event, even something as seismic as what happened on January 6th, I think we're going to be disappointed again and again. But I think if we're looking for the sanctity in the mundane, if we're looking for something sanctified in a conversation I have with my neighbor, if I'm looking for something sanctified in a glass of Cabernet with my friend Pete, who has Fox News on all the time, is a big Sean Hannity fan. I think there can be sanctity in that. I think that there can be sanctity in being convicted. I'll give you something specific. And I hope this makes sense. The way that I speak to my wife and my kids, I realized that we're in a time where virtues like grace are lacking. Mm-hmm. And for my oldest is 20, she's about to be 21. And much of her life, I did have categorical views on things I thought were really important. So there were many conversations where, whether I said it out loud or just had a certain posture of, I am right and you are wrong. And to the extent that you agree with me, you're going to be okay. But listen, sometimes that is the case where if the parent constantly is thinking about the best interest of the child, there are going to be times when the child's just wrong, and you got to put bumpers on that lane they're bowling in and make sure that they don't cause too much harm to themselves or others. But a lot of times it's just about grace. It's just about delighting in that child, or delighting in your spouse, and delighting in their presence you used a word before that I've come to learn more about over the last year, and that's affirm, not just accept as if I'm some, greater authority that is, that has this power to, I accept you. Like, who cares? We're all creatures, we're all kind of in this together. But to affirm, to celebrate just the presence of that person on their terms, who they are. The older of my two boys, he used to touch everything, including garbage cans. Like, it just grossed me out. And sometimes he'd get sick because he touched something and he, got the germs. But that's part of who he is. He was so curious and wanted to touch and wanted to feel and wanted to experience. And, so as opposed to shaming the child for touching something, he'll have to learn some hard lessons himself and maybe kind of adjust as he goes forward. Most stuff isn't life-threatening or even going to put him in serious harm's way. But to celebrate his curiosity and his joie de vivre, I think that's better to emphasize than the don't touch that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that you talked about earlier is that people are intellectually lazy. And the thing that always keeps coming to mind for me is the view of faith as imagination. That faith is also being willing to kind of see beyond what we see, to kind of think out, imagine what God could do and what can be done. And I think the thing that seems to be lacking in our time, I think definitely lacking in our politics, is that lack of faith. Or lack of imagination, that we can actually see something that may be out beyond our own, what we are expecting. And I think, that's something that I'm still learning about the importance of that as faith as imagination, because I think if we don't do that, then we kind of rely on what's here and sometimes what the circumstances are. And those circumstances sometimes can lead us down some crazy paths. So
yeah, it sounds to me like you're on the right track, Dennis. If you're connecting faith to imagination, what I would connect as part of that equation is creativity.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we are created in God's image. Each of us is created in God's image. And what's one of God's biggest attributes is his attribute as a creator, right? So creativity, what he did is he brought order out of chaos, right? So bringing order out of chaos is part of what we do as in the image of God, little creators, right? So I think that's part of what faith is determining, man, this just doesn't make sense, and thinking it through and trying to make sense out of something that doesn't make sense. But it takes creativity, it takes imagination to start to put some of those pieces together. And then inevitably, we don't have all the answers. No matter how many PhDs we got or, how many answers we arrive at, every answer just seems to spur 100 more questions.
Yeah.
So that's where the creativity is in filling in some of those blanks. But being willing to go about that, to come to a certain conclusion, almost like a rock climber has like a nook that they're grabbing onto to get to that next step. And sometimes you're hanging on by a fingernail, but just something to hold on to. And that's definitely, you could describe my own faith journey that way for sure, because there were times when I first became a Christian, it was early 2000s, and immediately I started to see things that challenged my faith. My brother, again, I'm bringing my brother up again, but he summed it up. There are certain things that I think some of the folks I was going to church with that weren't embodying the virtues that I was reading about in Scripture. They were prioritizing things like, I didn't get the whole thing about don't cuss. I don't cuss. So they think I'm a Christian. They're going to become a Christian because I don't cuss. First of all, I'm from Jersey, so we don't cuss, we curse, right?
Yeah.
But I was thinking, man, if that's the thing that you think is going to convert a lot of, I don't know, maybe there are some people who are like, came to the Lord, like, that guy doesn't cuss. I better become a Christian now. You feel like it just doesn't make sense to me. But, you might not cuss, but you're still a jerk. My brother put it another way. He cussed when he said it. But, he
I
said,
can kind of guess what word he used too.
yeah, Jesus may love you, but everybody else thinks you're a, fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
So again and again, I came up against this thing. I'm looking around. I'm like, these guys are, and these folks are just behaving in a way that I don't know. I just don't admire. I don't think embodies what I would define as good. And now that I'm a Christian, I'm really studying scripture. They're not embodying what the Bible would define as good or virtuous. So I kept on coming against faith struggles. But, if I just continue to dive in, God has a way of holding on to you. God has a way of when you're feeling the most lost, to whether it's something inspiring that you see in nature, or I read a lot, something inspiring that maybe somebody recommends to me, or in another person, in a conversation like this one, an edifying conversation, encouraging, inspiring conversation that you have. God has a way of giving you just that buoy, that mooring, if you will, to allow you to, again, climb up that wall or climb up that ladder, keep on understanding more. So, yeah. I want to hold out hope, man. I want to hold out hope that Trump has not taken over for Jesus. That, or not even Trump now, but like Trumpism. A lot of our folks, a lot of our friends are, I don't know, they forgot that time and again and again and again, not just the Jews, but in throughout post, in the Christian era, after the time of Jesus, the people of God just got distracted. They got distracted, not by something that was 180 degrees off. Sometimes it was 180 degrees off of what was good and godly, but a lot of times it was more like 5 or 10 degrees off of what was good and godly. You just 5 or 10, just kind of like the serpent in tempting Eve. It wasn't, he was quoting scripture, but it was just a little bit off. You know what I mean? And I think looking at the Jews at Mount Sinai, they just heard the voice of God himself, and yet they're building this golden calf or the golden Trump or something.
Well, there was a golden Trump. So
yeah, there was. I thought that was just poetic. I thought that was so beautiful in its own kind of weird, warped way. Because it's like, help us see. And if you can't see that, like, I don't know what to do for you anymore,
No.
But the reason I think the Israelites were worshiping at the golden calf is because it was a form of worship that they recognized. We understand this. This looks familiar to us. This is not alien to us, So it was something that they could fall right into easily. So are we deceived to think that we in 2022 can't fall into something similar? What forms of idolatry are we falling into that we don't even recognize as such? That but when somebody comes in and starts with a personal preference, a political preference, a social preference, and then back scripture into it, they cut shards of scripture out of verses here, out of verses there, and they back it into an a priori, a predisposed preference that they have. Mm-hmm. It's a form of idol worship. It's a form of thou shalt have no other gods before me. You just put something before the word, and that's your political preference, right? So I think we got to be on guard. Me too, man. Me too. I got to be on guard too.
So, one of the questions that I've also had about, since you've already kind of brought up Trump, is why are there so many people of faith that follow someone whose life doesn't even come close to living as a Christian? In many cases, I don't think he even really knows some of the basic aspects of faith. But yet there are people who see him as godly, that he is going to restore the nation. They see him bringing order, when it seems more that he's bringing chaos. And so what do you think people see in him that makes them want to follow him?
The biggest reason that I can tell can be summed up in one of his campaign taglines: "He'll fight for us." So I think they tapped into this mindset that's been nurtured for a long time. And the deception is that we're in a culture war. You know, they're trying to take Christmas away from us. Like there's a war on Christmas. You know, the next thing you know, we're not going to be able to worship. You know, they conflated things we had to do for the pandemic with, they're trying to take your freedom of religion away. We're not going to be able to worship the way we want. So it all feeds into this mindset of there's a they that's coming for us, you know, and to identify, it requires a lot of cognitive dissonance, but we're all guilty of that. We're all prone to that. But that general mindset of there's a culture war, and if there's a culture war, we now have to define who the enemy is. And then once we define who the enemy is, we have to then go about defeating that enemy. So if that's the mindset, then Trump kind of makes sense, because everybody can see Trump's faults. You know, even guys who are the most ardent Trump supporters in church, they might even concede, just to look like they're being objective, well, I wish he wouldn't tweet so much, you know. But the winning that supposed war becomes the number one. Oh, can you hear Charles Mingus?
That's okay.
That's Charles Mingus III. I can make him stop. I can put him upstairs if you want, but we can have him as sort of background music.
It's cool. I have cats, so I understand the whole how animals act. So
it's inevitable, man. Like, he has such brilliant timing. He always does this when we're recording. So if that's the mindset, it kind of makes sense, but it requires a few things. Number one, it requires, again, a lot of proclivities. Proclivity to generalize. Anybody who isn't a Trump fan is one of them. Generalize. It requires mischaracterizing. So assuming somebody who might have voted for a Democrat once, or maybe didn't vote for Trump in 2016 and 2020, is also then, you know, they want to kill babies, and they want to, you know, take away our guns, and they want to, I don't know. You get one data point. This person didn't vote for Trump. Oh, they must be all these other things. So generalize, mischaracterize, and then vilify. You demonize that person. Generalize, mischaracterize, and vilify, because if you can vilify them, then they're part of the culture war on the other side. They're part of the other side. And that's where, again, that's where a Trump makes sense. But it's a form of idolatry, because what you're doing is you're elevating these generalizations, mischaracterizations, and vilifications over and above everything else in the Bible. Because let's face it, we can open up just about any page of the Bible, and it testifies against the words, actions, and character of Donald J. Trump. You know, we can go just about anywhere, whether it's about the words, character, and actions of Donald Trump, or whether it's about fools, you know, all throughout Proverbs, for example, whether it's or through all through Scripture, about fools who fall into these traps of, you know. So I don't know. I think that element, he's fighting for us, can explain a lot of it if you really think about that, and then start to talk to your friends who are, you know, hopefully we still have friends who maybe disagree with us about Trump or Trumpism or what it's all about, and maybe understand it within that context. Because I think if we understand it within that context, then we have some practical work to do. And I'm not saying I'm 100% right on this. I'm just saying, if I'm in the conversation, I got some hope. We got a fighting chance, you know, or a non-violent fighting chance, you know, to persuade, but also to have that person persuade me a little bit, perhaps, you know?
Well, that's an interesting thing too, is that have the other side, to listen to the other side and have them maybe persuade you a bit. I mean, how does that work? Especially, you know, you talked about your friend Pete, who listens to Fox a lot. You know, how do you allow that person to change you, even though you may disagree sharply on an issue?
Well, there's a lot of points of agreement. I mean, I love Pete's dog. Bella's always a pleasure to see in the morning. I love Pete's. He's a great cook. His wife is a great baker. He's got wonderful stories. He's originally from Italy. He's got wonderful stories about how he came here. And, so there's a lot of points where I appreciate who he is. There's obviously a lot of points of disagreement. I wish he wasn't listening to so much Tucker Carlson. But, if I nurture that relationship, maybe a conversation with me takes him away from Tucker for an hour. That's doing some good work. But maybe there's something that I hadn't thought of. I hadn't thought of something that I'm saying that isn't as thoughtful, isn't giving him as much credence, and again, sometimes it's on difficult issues. One of my kids decided not to get the vaccine. Mm-hmm. That's a hard one. Because I think he's putting himself and others in harm's way. So that's a really hard one. But just understanding why he came to that conclusion, again, gives me a fighting chance, keeps me in the conversation, So I still don't agree with it. I don't even agree with why he ended up completely digging his heels in. It was more of a reaction to people shaming him and harassing him and just mistreating him because he was at first hesitant and then eventually became pretty stuck in his decision. But I just thought if I treat him as a human being, as a thinking human being, and honor where he is in his thinking process, mm-hmm. I at least have a chance of persuading him. And it's not to say he persuaded me that to be anti-vax, because I'm not. Certainly I'm not on this issue, but he persuaded me to understanding how someone could come to that conclusion. So there is a little bit of persuasion there. Mm-hmm. I would say most persuasion is just like, again, it's not 180 degrees in one conversation. It's 1 degree in one conversation with one person that you are in relationship with, and being open to the possibility that you might be persuaded otherwise. Listen, I was a Jew. I was a non-Christian, non-believing Jew. Somebody persuaded me that Jesus died and rose again as Messiah, Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Sometimes you're not going to be persuaded. Sometimes a person that you're talking to is not going to be persuaded, and that's okay. But sometimes if you have the truth, then you got pretty firm ground to stand on, and hopefully you'll bring folks along with you,
Where do you see the church as an institution kind of trying to build bridges? Because I think someone who is watching the news may think that the church is just one other institution that's just driving a wedge between people. But where have you seen that happening, where people are kind of trying to bring people to the table, to try to form relationships, to bridge those divides?
Yeah. Russell Moore reminded us that the church is worldwide. Mm-hmm. So I sometimes forget and get myopic and thinking the church is just what I'm seeing here in Santa Clarita, and Johnny Mac's influence. But it's not. It's worldwide. There's some great work being done in individual churches, even here in Southern California. The church that I attend now, I used to attend what I would consider I wouldn't say it's a fundamentalist church, but I would say a lot of fundamentalists go there. But I go to a church now that the work that we do, who we are as a people, is more defined by how we welcome folks who don't have houses right now, or reaching out to folks who may have been born on the other side of, these imaginary lines on maps that we draw to so that we can call this one illegal. How we treat folks among us who happen to be born on the other side of these lines on maps. So I think that's real bridge building, and if we ever forget how to do it, we need to look no further than Jesus himself. He was going to those people that were put out. They were, people with skin diseases. They couldn't be a part of the community. They needed to be separated away from. Well, Jesus was healing them and bringing them back into that. People who weren't born under one of the 12 tribes, he was going to folks who were either half step out or a whole step outside of that and dealing with them. He was going to lands where there were herds of pigs, totally unkosher. And he was sanctifying individuals and moments in time, even in places like that where, unkosher animals were hordes of them were, so we if we're looking to stay within this pure circle of only folks who believe what we think is the right way to believe, or I don't know. I just think we're not following Jesus's lead the right way. So just look for those opportunities, and that's how we can build bridges.
There seems to be these days a lot of talk about civil war. We just hear it. I don't think that there's a week that goes by I don't hear that. And it can get kind of scary. You kind of wonder, what could happen.
Yeah.
How does the church deal with that? How do Christians deal with that? I don't think that it doesn't mean that it will happen, but I think we all feel like there's this possibility of it happening. But how does a church speak to that?
It takes courage and it takes integrity on the part of leaders. And I think we've seen a lot of those leaders stand up. I just mentioned one. I mean, Russell Moore was the head of the ERLC. And his politics, if we're being objective, his politics are still super conservative.
Yes.
As we would think of it. But there's plenty of folks who, one by one, whether it's in journalism that identify as Christians, like E.J. Dionne or Michael Gerson, who in Gerson's case, he was associated with the conservative movement. I think he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. But our own pastors, have to identify it, and they need strength and support from us because they're getting. I know pastor friends of mine are getting dozens, if not hundreds, of emails from their Trump supporting congregants objecting to the wrong bumper sticker on one of the cars in their parking lot. What are we going to do about this? Even something as simple as that, as just inconsequential as that. And there's great uproar about it. And there's plenty of room in a lot of Bible studies and a lot of church gatherings for folks who are just adamantly pro-Trump in our time. So a pastor, it's hard for a pastor or say a head of a Christian school, to confront that. There's too much cost and there's not enough support. Mm-hmm. So if we, number one, help a pastor or a Christian leader identify that and recognize it for what it is, and then come alongside them and say, we'll take some of that heat with you. I think that's something concrete that we can do, mm-hmm. assuming that you have a willing collaborator with that church leader. But I think it's just a hard job. A lot of leaders, number one, there are a lot of leaders who are just completely Trump trained, that they are of this mindset that there's a cultural war and Trump's fighting for us, and whoever's not for us is against us. And there's not much you can do there except to maybe just try to stay in that conversation. And again, persuade 1%. But there are a lot of others who just have almost thrown in the towel. I can't talk about this stuff because there's too much of a cost to talk about it, that it's, they've made this calculation of the Christian nationalists are too loud, too vocal, and present too much of a danger to everything else that's going on in our church, that if I address that, it's going to cause all kinds of harm to all the other ministries. So I just think that's the wrong calculation. Hmm. I think that it's a cancer. That thinking is a cancer, and it needs to be confronted. But the pastors who are even on the fence about it or are reluctant to address it, they need some help. They need some support, or they just need to be in dialogue with somebody who recognizes it for what it is. I think because I do think that there is, whether there's a majority or at least a plurality of folks in the churches who are just like, this, we got to stop, or just are not on the Trump train in general. There's more of a plurality. That 81%, I think, is that is often cited of evangelicals, I think, is a deceiving number. I think there's more of us.
Yeah. I've always disagreed with that number, just because I think evangelicals are far more diverse than people give them credit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's just a couple ways that, number one, we often forget to say 81% of white evangelicals, because that's the actual number that has come up. But the other big thing is that there are a number of people who are identifying as evangelical who aren't actually evangelical. And I'm not saying that because, like, I'm trying to be dismissive of, the problems that exist within the church. I'm saying that because there are a lot of folks who just don't go to church, wouldn't say that they believe in a risen Jesus, that some of these clear markers of what's an actual evangelical, they say it because they've been going to Trump rallies and everybody says they're an evangelical at Trump rallies. So, so I think a lot of those folks are included in that 81% number. And we just need to give voice. We need to work harder to give voice who aren't the loudest, who aren't the screamers,
So where do you see God working especially in these next few years, as we're kind of heading up to another presidential election in 2 years? Do you see some kind of a sense of a movement of where things are headed that can lead towards more reconciliation, kind of against the forces that want to divide and conquer?
I've asked questions like that of my guests, and I've asked almost as a way of saying, please give me some hope.
Well, yeah, because it's hard. It's hard to see that, but I think it must be there.
So, okay. So I'm going to give you the bad news first.
Okay.
As we've discussed, I am a Jew. So I am one generation removed from cousins of mine burning in ovens because of political differences, racial identification, and things, a lot of the things that, I wouldn't say it's the same as what we see going on now, but there's certainly rhymes with it. I'm two generation. My grandmother was born in Russia, or what's now the Ukraine, and she fled where her family was very prosperous for at least a century. She fled because, as she put it, the only thing the Tsarists and the Bolsheviks and the what do you call it? There were Tsarists, Bolsheviks, and who was the other group? Cossacks. There were all these different groups. The only thing, she said, all these other groups could agree on is that they all hated the Jews. So, so I come from a long line of people whose houses were burned down, who were killed, who were, terrible things happened to because of these sorts of political and racial, ethnic, religious divisions, right? So if things get worse, that's a possibility. And there's something in me that I really hope it doesn't go that way, but we've survived, right? Mm-hmm. The people of God have survived. Before Constantine made Christianity an official religion, it was a persecuted minority. Christians were getting slaughtered as sport, right? But Christianity survived. Before that, there were the Babylonians and the Persians and all these, powerful empires. And yet the Jews survived. The people of God survived. So listen, the bad news is there's a possibility that democracy as we know it ain't going to exist in 10 years or 20 years. But that's okay. The people of God will survive. I believe that. But here's the thing. Let me give some good news. Salt that sour a little bit. I see people that as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, or even more recently, that you might have considered part of a problem that has now metastasized, that have awakened in a way. So some of the leading voices of conservatism, Charlie Sykes, Bill Kristol, a neoconservative, Joe Walsh, one of the big stars of the Tea Party movement. A lot of these guys and gals have awakened, people who are part of the Trump administration. So many people who are part of the Trump administration that, served, some of them with great reservations from the get-go, saying, well, somebody's got to occupy. I don't like Trump. Don't think that he's competent and all these things, but I got to serve because somebody with experience and integrity has to serve in those posts, and I'm going to do my best to make the best out of this administration. There are others who were hardcore, 2016 and into the first parts of the administration, who then later sort of awakened, if you will, to the real dangers of Trumpism. And one at a time, we see folks coming out, and different incidents along the way. Some folks had this, this epiphany, whether it was when he was standing side by side with Putin and preferring Putin over his own security community, whether it was Charlottesville and good people on both sides, whether it was, or even before that, I like my candidates who aren't caught, talking about John McCain, or whether it was early June, right after George Floyd was killed, and waving a Bible, in front of a church he never attended, not even having gone in to do some prayer and some meeting with the pastor, but just as a photo op. There are these incidents along the way where folks are like, that's it, and January 6th. Now, some folks have kind of reverted back post January 6th, but there's any number of exit ramps. And each time we're seeing folks who, again, to use the same word again, just awaken. So we can glean a sense of hope from one individual at a time. But again, if we're looking for this one, I thought on the morning of January 6th, I'm on the West Coast. So it was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and I tuned on the radio to, it was the end of the Wilcow Majority. So the Wilcow Majority is on Patriot Radio on XM right before Hannity. So I tuned into the end of Wilcow's show because I wanted to hear the end of his show, and I wanted to hear the beginning of Sean Hannity's show, because in my mind I'm thinking, this is a big thing. This is kind of like September 11th. And surely this is one of those things where we can all come together. We can all recognize this as this has gone too far. We all got to come together and do something about this. And what do you know, on that day, when people were still trying to burn down the Capitol, when people were still defecating in the Capitol, when people were trying to stop the election from happening, stop the peaceful transfer of power, there was Hannity with the talking points that then congealed within the next 24 hours. Well, look what you made us do. Where was your outrage when? Referring to violence that broke out over the summer. Many people are saying it was really Black Lives Matter that were inciting this, and false flag operation. We heard the beginnings, the seeds of those talking points on that day. So listen, we're not going to see this big, seismic event that changes everything. I just don't think we're going to see that, but we can see one person at a time. Mm-hmm. We can see it one conversation at a time. We can see it one relationship that's redeemed at a time. And if we're in for the long haul and we hold out hope in each other and in ourselves, and in God's creation and God's bigger redemption plan, man, I think we can keep going, man. I don't mean to be rose-colored glasses with all this. I'm just trying to share some of these things that have helped me through these last 5-6 years. Mm-hmm. Some of these things that have helped me continue to move forward and do good work. Some of these things that have helped me not get discouraged, but just keep on knowing that it's worth having that conversation with that person who just seems so damn obnoxious, who seems so lost in where they're at, who you might see as such a part of the problem. I don't want to be that. I mentioned Joe Walsh. Sorry, I'm kind of going off in a couple different directions here. I mentioned Joe Walsh. He came on our program, and I loved it. I learned about where he's at now. I learned a lot more about his backstory. I learned about certain things that he's really changed his views on. But then we talked about a couple areas where we do disagree. But again, it's like we disagree on guns, we disagree on immigration. But within that, we come from similar places. And it's not we completely disagree. We have some overlap of agreement in terms of actual policy. But fast forward, I was starting to get comments on the different places where our program shows up, YouTube and other places. And there was one commenter who said, who pointed to a tweet that he had in 2016 about, let's grab our muskets. If this doesn't go Trump's way, let's grab our muskets. And, you know, former Congressman Walsh talked about that. He said that was one of the dumbest things. But I'll tell you what, I probably got at least 1,000 more, if not 10,000 more, that were just as dumb. But they're dumb. And I have to keep on moving forward and acknowledge and own up to what I did wrong and try to do better going forward. You know, so I appreciated that. But this person just did not want to let that go. And not only that, she equated it with, she literally, within 2 comments, she got to the musket tweet to child rapists and Nazis. It took two comments to get there.
Wow.
One back and forth. And by the second comment, she child rapists and Nazis. I'm like, listen, dumb tweets do not equate to child rapists. Can we chill? So I don't want to be that person. Her nickname on YouTube was Trixie. I don't want to be Trixie. I like, you know, if somebody puts out a dumb tweet, I don't want to put them in the same boat with Hitler, you know? So
I think related to this question of hope, I want to kind of turn it around is, where are you seeing evil in our society? And because I think that we have to have to really look at hope, we also have to realize where there is also the dark side in our world. And, you know, I hesitate bringing that up because I don't want it to be, as you've talked about, us and them, but it also seems like you have to recognize where there is sin that's happening.
Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from with that question.
I think if we don't start with the evil within our own heart, we're in real trouble. I think, you know, it's not so coincidentally, I think the founders of the United States, of this country, started with that possibility. That if we don't earnestly and humbly account for that possibility, that we have this potential within each of us, then we're not able to deal with it in the world. I don't think we're that effective at dealing with it in the world. So constantly checking ourselves, checking myself to see where my own pridefulness or any number of other proclivities are being harbored and manifested. And, you know, and then being able to see through more humble glasses so that, again, you can then see other human beings through the lens of grace, right? And seeing them indeed as human beings. But maybe that's an easy way out of the question, or overly theologizing the question.
I think that's a good place to start, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But listen, it exists all around. And, you know, I have such limited control over, you know, people and events and all kinds of things around us. So I try to think about what I do have some agency over. You know, if the people in my family and my circle of friends allow me the privilege of some influence, that's good. You know, and listen, sometimes it's happening with folks. We've been talking most of this time about folks who are on the Trump train, but there are friends who are definitely not on the Trump train, like Trixie, who I just described, you know, that we have to. There's Charles Mingus III again. Sorry about that. There are folks who are not in that delusion, if you will, that we can exhort. You know, I heard a friend of mine, he's become a friend who, his name's Pete Dominic, who had someone on who studies, what was the episode? It was a controversial issue, but Pete always does such a great intellectual, erudite, deep dive, brings on a great expert. It might have been for critical race theory, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But the expert was really, really knowledgeable, really, really winsome, really had a broad knowledge of the subject. But at one point he said, he was talking about folks who didn't agree with his perspective. He was a critical race theory specialist. And again, I might be wrong about the subject, but it was a subject with the same level of potential immediacy and intensity in today's culture. But at one point, this fellow said, these are the same people, and then fill in the blank. And Pete disrupted him. He said, well, listen, I'm hesitant to say these are the same people, because that's falling into a similar trap. You might have something to offer here to help us understand our nation's history through a more critical, a 360 lens. That's very helpful. But in doing so, I don't want to fall into some of these same traps of these are the same people, the generalizing. Now, Pete didn't say all that, but just his gentle exhortation was really appreciated. So knowing that it's not just one side, if you want to think of it that way. Mm-hmm. It's any one of us. Mm-hmm. It's any one of us, right? So, yeah, I'd love to give you a simpler, shorter answer of like, here's where it is and here's what we could do. It's that head coming up and we got to bonk it on the head and, be done with this. But I just don't think it's that simple.
Well, it goes back to nuance.
Yeah.
Things are not always as easy as we would love them to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to wrap it up with one final question. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately in my own life. And I think the question I have is, what are you thankful for or grateful for?
Oh, baby. That is a great question and is so apt for I don't know if you know, like how well you know me, but that is so on the money for me and something that I've had to consciously work on. I have been consciously working on it for almost exactly 15 years.
Wow.
Now, I haven't shared this exercise publicly, except sometimes in conversations it comes up. But I've been, for my prayer time, I write, mm-hmm. and it's just my conversation with God. And the only there's a couple kind of structure-ish things that I do with it. One is just being of that mindset that I am in conversation with God. God knows me better than I know me, so I can't BS God. So I just gotta be in conversation with him, just completely as transparent as I could possibly be, and free flow of thought. The only other structured thing that I try to do daily is, what am I thankful for? And usually I try to hit at least 3 things. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's more. So it's interesting that you asked that, because I have to consciously do it because I had been praying for a sense of peace. I had been praying for some other things that being mindful about what I'm thankful for helped lead me to, So what am I thankful for today? There's this one little bloom in our backyard. It's a yellowish, orangish rose. I'm thankful for that. Charles Mingus III, our pooch. We have Bailey too, but Charlie is a rescue and he's been getting better. He had a difficult puppyhood. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thankful that even though he's been barking in the background, I'm thankful that he and I are pals, that he doesn't bite me on the butt as much anymore. I am thankful for my conversation with you, Dennis. It's just so, there's certain things about life when you're alive and being alive is worth living. Meeting a new friend. I'm not trying to say this to blow smoke up your butt. Like, no. I'm really thankful for a conversation with a new friend.
Yeah.
I could go on, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think that those things, I'm starting to see the importance of talking about gratitude, and that's important because I think it, as you've said earlier, it grounds us.
Yeah.
And I am thankful for a conversation, and I think thankful just for even kind of the simple things of having cats that kind of do their thing in my life, and so that's important. And I think a good place to end this conversation for this time. Yeah.
Let's visit again, though. I'd love to hang out with you again.
Yeah, because this was incredibly cool.
Yeah.
If people want to follow you, any places on social media they should be looking for you?
Sure. On all the socials, we're even on TikTok now. I might even do the cha-cha once or twice. Is TPNR, TPANDR pod, TPNR pod. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. You can find us there. And depending on when this goes up, our website is politicsandreligion.us.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something wrong with the site for some reason. So it's going to politicsandreligion.podbean.com. But if you just look up Talk Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, apostrophes after the N instead of the G's, Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, that you can find us somewhere. So
all right. Well, thank you again. This was I loved having this hour of conversation.
I really enjoyed getting to know you better, Dennis. You asked such great questions. It's going to get me thinking about this stuff, for the rest of the day, if not longer. So really great questions, thought-provoking. So I appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Well, I really enjoyed my time chatting with Corey. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. And I did put the link to his podcast in the show notes. Definitely give it a listen sometimes. He has a lot of very well-known people that he has on his podcast, and I think it's something that you will enjoy. Also, make sure to follow us here. Follow us we have our Facebook page, we have a Twitter feed, and YouTube. Make sure that you follow us and subscribe. And those links are in the show notes. You can also visit us at enroutepodcast.org. That's where we try to sometimes have some additional material about podcast episodes. And if you have a question or comment, feel free to drop me an email. I really do want to hear what you all are thinking, what questions you have, what comments, what things I can do better, what things are bugging you. Please send an email to reverendpodcast@gmail.com. And I look forward to hearing those emails, to reading those emails. Also, it would be really important, and I would be incredibly, eternally thankful if you would leave a rating, a 5-star rating or review on your favorite podcast app. Definitely you can do that on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. I believe you can do it on Spotify, and there are some others. That really helps for other people to find this podcast. And I think that this is a podcast that it's worth people hearing what it has to say. So if you can do that, it would be really helpful for me. Thank you. And then finally, I just want to let you know, please consider, if you have a $1 or $2 or $3, making a donation. The donation helps to cover costs that come with trying to put this podcast together. Your donations really help for me to continue to put out good content, and I would love if you could do that. The link to donate is in the show notes. Well, that is it for this episode of En Route, the podcast that is at the intersection of church and Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, Godspeed, and see you soon.